Hello, welcome. This is Liz with Voices of Christian Dreamers. VCD is a dreamer-led movement for a more informed, abiblical conversation on immigration. And we're glad that you're joining us today for our webinar series on immigration and faith. Our topic today is faith-based advocacy, and we're grateful to have Jenny Yang on to help us better understand the biblical roots of advocacy and how we can apply our faith in civic engagement, including but not limited to on issues like immigration. Jenny is an author, speaker, and the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, where she provides oversight for all advocacy initiatives and policy positions related to immigration, refugee resettlement, and more. She has co-written with our friend and colleague Matthew Sorens the book Welcoming the Stranger, which I have here, and the second edition actually came out in 2018. Jenny, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that you're on, and I hope to engage with you all in the conversation today.
Yeah, so before we kind of hit on the topic of faith-based advocacy, as I do with my guests, I'd love to kind of start off a little bit with your personal background and sort of your own journey leading up to your work now.
Sure. So I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm the daughter of immigrants. My parents had immigrated from South Korea. And my identity as being the daughter of immigrants really shaped my understanding of being an American, also of being a Christian. And it was through that lens that I grew up, and I went to school in Maryland, and I studied international relations in college. And I remember studying abroad in Madrid, Spain, and it was interesting being there because I know in the U.S. what it feels like to be a minority, but I also understood in Spain that there were also a lot of immigrants to Spain as well. And so being a guest in Spain, living there for about 8 months, but also seeing other immigrants experience life in Spain was eye-opening for me. And so I remember really experiencing and seeing blatant instances of racism throughout Spain. And then that summer that I was there, I volunteered at the UN doing some research around asylum issues, and then also volunteering at an anti-racism organization, doing a lot of grassroots work as well. And that really developed my desire to continue to do work on immigration issues coming back to the States. And so I've actually been at World Relief for about 15 years. I first started working in the refugee program, and then I took on a full-time advocacy and policy position shortly thereafter. And so I've been doing policy work mostly around immigration and refugee issues for almost a decade. And I love it because not only do I get to engage the government on influencing them on policies and decisions they're making, but I also get to mobilize the church to understand why advocacy is important and really equipping the church at large to engage on issues and use their voice as well. So it's been a really fun responsibility.
Wow, thanks. So you are a fieldwork veteran on this issue. And so when we talk about something like advocacy, can you help define what is advocacy to you?
Yeah, so I know advocacy is a little bit abstract. I think sometimes when people hear advocacy, they think, well, I can never do that, or can you actually have any influence? And I think for me, advocacy is really about using your voice and resources to influence people in positions of power to change a situation. And basically what that means is all of us have the ability to speak up. All of us have a voice. All of us have a story. And it's utilizing those things to speak into, most oftentimes, our elected officials, getting them to understand our stories and our perspective, and having that change their particular position on an issue. Sometimes our government, for example, is doing a lot of great things, and it may mean that we commend them for that and say, yes, keep doing that. But a lot of times it means that we believe they're doing something incorrectly, something that's unjust, perpetuating systems of oppression, as an example, and for us to speak up and use our resources and voice to change those governmental policies, I think is really important as well. And so I think advocacy itself can be very practical. It can be something that I think, in most social movements we've seen around the world, and even in the US, it's always been started by small groups of people that have believed that something was wrong. And we advocate because we believe the things as they are now are not the ways that things should be. And so we know, looking around us, that there's a lot of injustice. And being at World Belief, the common analogy that we often talk about is, we know that the story of teaching a man how to fish, right? Is you shouldn't just give him a fish and a fishing pole, but it's teaching him how to fish. But then what if that person fishes in a pond, and there's a factory upriver that's sending all of its pollutants down into his pool? Wouldn't you also care about his environment and the fact that he can be fishing and providing for himself, but in the end, he's actually in a toxic environment? And so what does it look like to look at systemic issues? And I think for those of us who really care about the flourishing of our neighbors, we have to look at it not just as at an individual level, but at a systemic level as well. And truly loving and caring for our neighbors is also caring about the systems and the structures in which they live.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And for us Christians coming at it from a faith perspective, so we heard with our previous webinar, Dr. Danny Carroll talking about kind of God's heart for immigrants, God's heart for those who are vulnerable within our midst. Does the Bible actually talk about advocacy?
Well, I think the Bible is full of advocates. Actually, it's fascinating. You see specific examples of individuals being used by God to redeem and reconcile people, to bring about God's vision of shalom for either the nation of Israel or for our neighbors. And so just, one example of that is Moses. He was specifically appointed by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery, out of oppression. He is an advocate. He literally had to go before Pharaoh in order to talk about the plight of the Israelites to get his attention, and it led to them being led out of Egypt. And so Moses is an advocate for his people. Esther is also another woman of the Bible who was an advocate for her people. She was also someone, as I defined advocacy before, who used her voice and her resources to speak to someone in the position of power, to basically talk about the genocide that was being planned against her people. We also see others that are advocates as well. The story of Nehemiah, who was basically heartbroken about the city of Jerusalem, that he actually had to go back and rebuild the walls there. And so you see instances of advocates in the Bible, but perhaps the greatest advocate of all is Jesus himself. It actually says that Jesus was a paraclete, or literally an advocate for all of humanity before God. In fact, in 1 John 2:1, it actually says, my dear children, I write to you, but if so that you will not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father. Basically, the paraclete literally translates into advocate, and that's what describes Jesus himself. And so if Jesus is the advocate on behalf of humanity, then I believe we are called to be ambassadors of Christ, to also be advocates on behalf of others who are in situations of oppression or of injustice. And so I ultimately think by doing advocacy, we're ultimately representing Christ himself, especially trying to change situations of injustice. And I think just to mention that when you look at these characters in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, of Moses and Esther and Nehemiah, just as an examples of people who were advocates when they saw oppression or when their hearts were broken, that their hearts were stirred by something that they saw around them. I think that is an initial point where a lot of times your heart is led towards something. But also, secondly, they prayed and fasted to change the situation. What you see in Esther is that she went back and she prayed and fasted. Even in the story of Nehemiah, he tore his clothes and fasted and prayed. And even with Moses, you see him conversing with God. And I think that spiritual act of praying and fasting is critical to our advocacy. But then the last thing I would say about these biblical stories as well is not only did they have a heart for the people or the issue, that they had these spiritual practices that changed situations, but the last thing they did is they always did in community. That you see in each of these stories that they were never called to do it by themselves. In fact, Moses told God that he felt unqualified, that he felt like he was didn't have a voice. And so God sent Aaron to be the spokesperson with him. In the story of Nehemiah, you see that he had a team of people who brought resources together and different skills to rebuild the wall. Even with Esther, you see her within our family and also our community, also leaning on them for help as well. So when God calls us to do advocacy and to be advocates, he doesn't call us to do it alone. And so I think the scriptural stories of these advocates is really important because it helps concretize not only why we should do it, but the fact that there's oftentimes these spiritual discipline that we need to implement as part of our discipleship in order to do the work that God calls us to do as well.
And from what I'm hearing is that, right, Bible commands us to love our neighbor. We know that. But sometimes when we come up against these systemic issues, these systemic injustices, that love your neighbor means being a voice and advocating on their behalf. So there's some people that might say, some questions that we've heard is that, well, but politics is really dirty. Should Christians be mixed up, involved in politics? And how would you respond to a question like that?
Yeah, I think that is a common question, and I understand where that question is coming from, because I think even growing up, I just felt so far removed from the government. I sometimes thought, well, how is what they're going to be doing affect me? And I think that question is important. At the same time, looking in the broader context and saying, well, how is the government not just affecting me, but how is it affecting my neighbor? And oftentimes when you look at injustice around us, a lot of times it is perpetuated by the government or about the policies and systems that are constructed around that. And so I think for us, we have to remember that God is over everything, that we oftentimes try to divide things into the sacred and the secular, when I believe everything to a certain degree is sacred, that God is over church, but he's also over government, that God is over the arts, that he's over music, that he's over companies. And I think the reason I say that is because if we're really seeking the shalom of our cities, of our neighborhoods, of our neighbors, then we have to enter into every single place in which there is darkness. And whether there's darkness in how educational systems are run, or how healthcare systems are run, or how we believe the government's implementing policies, I believe God calls us to enter into the dark places wherever that is. And oftentimes those systems are set up by the government. And so especially for many of us who call the United States home, we live in a democracy where our voices are important and they're absolutely influential. Our elected officials are put in their positions because of us, because of our vote, because of, for those of us who can vote, because of what we've been talking about in our politics. And so in the end, we have to remember that even though the president may seem far removed from us, that he ultimately reports to us, and our officials also the same thing. They report to us. And so, as much as we can influence their decision making, it's an opportunity to influence how our cities and our communities work. And I also think that a lot of times it can seem a bit daunting, but at the same time, if we do not speak up, there's a vacuum created in which other people who don't represent our values will speak into that situation. And it makes a lopsided situation because it perpetuates the cycle then that we are not influencing when other people speak into a situation that actually directly impacts us or our neighbors. And so I know, and I can appreciate the concern that we shouldn't engage with government. At the same time, I think we have an incredible opportunity to be influential and to actually use that power and authority that all of us have, I think, to be able to influence a lot of the decisions that they're making as well.
So talking about some of the values, you had mentioned some of the values that we're called to advocate and apply in terms of our engagement with policymakers, et cetera. And advocacy is obviously for everybody. People are able to engage, and it's open for all. But are there, coming at from a faith perspective, are there distinctives that we are called as people of God, as people who take scripture as our ultimate authority for our worldviews and how we structure sort of our interactions? Are there distinctives to sort of a faith-based advocacy versus a more sort of general advocacy? I think you touched upon, and Jenny, you touched upon some of it, prayer and fasting, and are there others that you see?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think for those of us who follow Christ, that there's the distinctive of us having scriptures to really guide how we are to do it. I think we can look at doing advocacy as a secular exercise, and obviously there's best practices of what it means to raise our voice and organize. At the same time, I think there are spiritual practices, like you were saying, Liz, of prayer and fasting that I think have to ground our response when it comes to advocacy. The other thing I would say is that, a lot of times I go into Hill offices or meetings with our elected officials, and a lot of people say, oh, I shouldn't talk about being a Christian. And I actually say, no, you should talk about being a Christian. You should talk about why your faith informs your viewpoint, why your faith informs your support for specific policy, for example, why your faith informs your point of view. I think our story and our perspective, our faith is such a critical component of our identity that to not speak to that would be a disservice. And I think a lot of times our elected officials and staffers respect that because they understand where we're coming from. They believe that we're being honest about it. And I believe it provides value to the conversation. It provides moral impetus a lot of times for people to consider a different point of view than maybe what they're thinking about already. And so because of all of those things, I think for us to not shy away from our Christian identity is really important in the advocacy that we do. There's a lot of organizations or different causes that people advocate on that they speak about their values. They speak about their values of loving the environment or loving animals or loving or even like healthy eating habits, whatever the issue may be. They always enter into the conversation based on values. And I think for us, especially those of us doing advocacy around immigration issues, that values-driven conversation is central to our advocacy. And so I would always encourage people to not shy away from that, and also use those principles, especially biblical principles, to inform our perspective on certain policy issues.
Yeah, I love what you said about having prayer and fasting and these spiritual disciplines sort of undergird our advocacy. Because ultimately, when you think about it, maybe even from a political perspective, it's should always be all about numbers or power, right? Or sort of this idea of political calculus, etc. And there's a space for that. But as people of God, we also understand that sometimes we may not be coming right from a position of we are the largest group. We may be, for better or for worse, or we may be the most vocal group. But that we also sort of invite or really ask for the Spirit to prepare the path and to allow us to kind of engage in these conversations.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, especially when you are engaged in advocacy or justice work in general, that it's running a marathon. It's not running a sprint. That you need to change narrative. You need to change policies. You need to change all of these things, and it can be really wearing and very tiring. But I think having this long view that actually we're not in control of everything, that God is doing the work, that He's moving people's hearts, that He's changing people's minds on these things, gives us a freedom then to be able to fully operate in the gifts and the callings that God has placed on our lives. And so I do think that having that long view of things and having that underpinning of knowing that that God is ultimately sovereign over all of these things, I think is really freeing and empowering for us as advocates in this work.
Amen. So, and you touched upon a little bit of this, but I kind of wanted to draw out some more of your thoughts. But what does kind of effective advocacy look like in, let's talk about kind of the American political system specifically. Certainly not all political systems look like ours, but what have you seen to be examples of effective advocacy?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples that I can think about. Well, for one, I mean, I think what the Voices of Christian Dreamers are doing is powerful and is really effective. And I think you got the VCD is so powerful because it's bringing your own stories to the table to say, hey, we have a story and a perspective, and using that to organize and empower and educate and mobilize people, I think is awesome. So I will commend you guys as well. I also think that there's churches doing amazing advocacy work as well. There's a church out in Bend, Indiana, where where they're doing, or I'm sorry, not Bend, Indiana, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where they have been partnering with the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what the church has started to do is to run marathons, and they basically run with sticks in their hands to represent the women in the DRC who often have to go out to get firewood and are victims of gender-based violence when they do that. It's a sign of solidarity as well as a commitment for these runners to remember the stories of these women as they run. And they use their run to not only raise awareness from their community right there in Fort Wayne, but also to raise money to support churches in Congo that are supporting a lot of the victims of gender-based violence. So I think that's an incredible form of advocacy. They've met with their mayor and their elected officials on Congo issues as well, which I think has been really effective as well. I think there's other, like even at my own church in Baltimore City, there's a woman I know, Alice Huang, who's doing these monthly justice conversations within our church where she picks a topic and brings in guest speakers. We do book readings. So just even starting the conversation. And so she's a person I think who's an amazing advocate as well. And I think I give these specific examples because some of these things can be thought of as a smaller action, whereas like this huge church in Indiana doing this amazing thing, that can be thought of as like this big complicated thing. But I want to say that advocacy can be done at any level. It can be an individual action, it can be an organizational action, it can be a community action. But I think being able to use our voice to influence the people around us in whatever capacity that is what's most important. And again, it can look like a variety of things. But I do think the spectrum of engagement is really, education and truth telling. I think especially in this environment right now, that telling the truth about the image of God in individuals has to be fundamental. And where there's so much mistruths or misinformation about any issue, especially around immigration, we have to be tellers of the truth. We have to be the ones creating the narrative that people are made in the image of God, and that humanizing language is not the language of the church. And then the other thing too is just, educating ourselves and our communities, reading books, being informed about ways to think about things is always really important. And then lastly is just, what does it mean to engage our churches and our communities, and how do we get our whole, church involved in advocacy? How do we, organize our friends and then go to the state capitol, participate in a protest? So again, these are all different levels of advocacy, but I think they all contribute to us creating an environment in which there can be the flourishing of our neighbors.
That's wonderful. Jenny, actually you touched upon some of the questions I was going to ask you, kind of follow-up questions, but so I get this question sometimes, and people say, so I get it that citizens should advocate, but what about non-citizens? What if you don't have citizenship? Or what if you don't even have legal status in this case, or even as a DACA recipient or a dreamer, or even just as an undocumented immigrant, or some other status situation? Can we advocate as well?
Yes, and I will say absolutely yes, because your legal status doesn't confer, it confers certain like legal rights, but it doesn't confer necessarily the power of your own story. And like your power, your perspective, your story is what ultimately draws connection to other people. And in the end, especially in this environment, in this country, in the United States of America, I think dreamers especially have been the ones that have single-handedly changed the conversation on immigration. I think the fact that you have your own story, you have how you came here, what it's like growing up in this country, are all parts of this conversation on immigration. So citizenship, that's part of the conversation, but being in this country, being, Americans and everything, maybe except on paper, that is what it means. And I think people relate to that narrative and to that story that is so powerful. And so I would not say that stories are less important just because of a legality. I think all stories have validity. And it's interesting. I was at an event at Georgetown, which was a dinner with Dennis McDonough, who was the chief of staff to President Obama.
And he was telling us, those of us in the audience, we're all part of, a faith community, and it was a small private dinner. He basically said that Dreamers, single-handedly pushed the issue of immigration from like a lower tier issue to like the number one tier issue for the president because of the advocacy of Dreamers. And so, that was directly being said by the chief of staff to the president, years ago. So to know that that Dreamers, that the power of their stories have literally changed the conversation, have reprioritized things for the president of the United States himself, speaks to the power of story and to the power of Dreamers to be able to change these conversations. So absolutely, keep sharing those stories, because I think there's nothing that will, in the end, statistics and data are sometimes important, but what's more important are stories. I think there's nothing better than sharing your experience, your story that will help change this conversation.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned some of the work of even Dreamers that have done, right, to kind of pave the way. Sometimes for me, it's easy to take it for granted. Oh, DACA is in place, we can speak up. But before DACA, there were individuals, right, like you said, Jenny, who didn't let their legal status limit, right, the potential of sharing their stories, of speaking up, being a voice in a way that sort of paved the way, brought this issue to national attention, and allowed those that come after, right, to really stand on their shoulders and kind of continue this work. And that's true not just for Dreamers, but for immigrants of all status, or all different categories, or refugees or asylees. And that's beautiful, the way that you kind of talked about how even the specific examples that you gave of churches engaging this issue is bringing people in, bring those who are afflicted or who are being personally impacted by these policy decisions, lifting their voice, but then also inviting those in their communities, whether it's their government, local city officials, right, or just members of their community in and outside of their church. So it's really kind of this collective work, right, this community effort, going back to what you mentioned towards the beginning.
Yeah, and I think there is a difference between speaking for someone and having someone share their own story. And so I think so much in this conversation around immigration, it's, they're speaking on behalf of them, or you're speaking on behalf of someone else. And no, I actually think the most powerful conversations, the things that change people's minds, the things that change our narrative around speaking about an issue is the people. And anytime you're able to share your own story and find identity and power in that is what is going to change these conversations. I can be in a congressional meeting and I can talk about, for example, how the refugee program works, who refugees are, how many refugees there are in the world. That's all fine and dandy. But if a congressperson meets with a refugee and the refugee themselves tells what it was like to flee a country out of persecution, to settle in a new land, and to be working and, all this stuff, that has been transformational. And I can attest to the fact that a lot of congressional folks hear the stories of immigrants themselves and are transformed more by hearing that testimony than they are by anything I can say. So, or any of us, oftentimes can say. And so again, I think you sharing your story, not only to people in positions of power, but I think anytime you share your story, there's a vulnerability there that allows other people to open up and share their own story. And I think that's why Dreamers, I think, are so courageous, because there's a vulnerability in actually saying, oh, okay, like, this is what has happened to me, to my family. And obviously a lot of Dreamers are in vulnerable situations, and for those stories to be shared to create commonality and community, I think is absolutely important.
That's great. So as we wrap up this conversation, one of my questions for you that I also posed when we spoke with Danny Carroll, but what are some words of encouragement that you have for Christians kind of wrestling through, thinking through this issue of immigration, thinking through about engaging in advocacy, and then also for those who are living maybe through the experience? What are some words of encouragement that you might have or want to share?
Yeah, I would just say that I think immigration right now is, it's always been a tough topic of conversation. It's always been something that has challenged people's perceptions about others, about how they think about everything, the economy, national security, cultural identity. It touches on all of those things, and so it is really challenging. But at the same time, I would encourage you to continue to speak up, continue to use your voice, and use the people, whether it's your own family members or your own church or your pastor, to influence them into thinking positively about immigrants is huge. And I think that can be a huge critical difference. I also think if you're a dreamer, please continue to share your stories and be bold, knowing that there is a community of people, especially a community of people of faith, who will come alongside of you and have you lead and to support you guys in leading the conversation. I think you guys have to be front and center, and you guys have changed the conversation. I think will be continue to play a central role in changing the conversation. And the last thing I would say as well is that we have to trust that even though things seem challenging now, that God is continuing to work to change hearts and minds, and that we have to do it with a community of believers. And so, as much as you can lean on to others, or your friends or church members or your small group to do it together, I think that's what God calls us to do. So I would encourage you to stay in community and to continue to share stories and continue to be truth tellers in your own circles, to really start changing the conversation on immigration.
Amen. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for just so eloquently walking us through sort of how to engage this, especially coming at it from a faith perspective, and even just living up to the calling that God has for us as His people, right? To stand aside, to advocate with and for those who are struggling, whether it's because of immigration or because of other circumstances. Please encourage you, our viewers, to check out Jenny's book, Welcoming the Stranger. And of course, we know that with these webinars, we can't go into great depth to uncover all of the wealth and around faith-based advocacy. And so we hope that you'll continue to explore this topic. To check out Welcoming the Stranger and other resources on it, you can visit www.christiandreamers.us for additional resources, as well as stories of dreamers and immigrants of faith. We thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks all.
Thanks.